It has been over 50 years since Apollo 17 left the last human footprints on the lunar surface in 1972. We possess infinitely more computing power today, yet returning humans to deep space has proven exponentially more difficult, revealing a profound paradox in modern aerospace engineering. This half-century gap raises an unavoidable question: why go back now? The answer lies in a fundamental shift in our strategic objectives. Apollo was a rapid sprint driven by Cold War tensions. Artemis is a calculated marathon designed to establish permanent, sustainable infrastructure. The Artemis II mission, targeted for launch no earlier than April 2026, is the first crewed test of a completely new orbital architecture. We are no longer executing direct descent missions for brief stays. The goal is to build a sustained presence around the moon. Driven by Space Policy Directive 1, the program targets the lunar South Pole rather than the equatorial regions visited by Apollo. This area holds the key to deep space survival, permanently shadowed craters containing billions of tons of water ice. In the vacuum of space, water ice is a strategic resource. It can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen to provide breathable air and chemical rocket propellant. The moon is effectively being positioned as a crucial refueling depot for future human missions to Mars. This strategic shift is accelerating a renewed space race, primarily between the United States and China. Both nations recognize that establishing the first operational infrastructure at the lunar South Pole will heavily influence the legal and economic frameworks of the emerging deep space economy. Artemis II is structurally distinct from its historical predecessors. The four-person crew will fly aboard the Orion spacecraft, a vehicle equipped with advanced life support and navigation systems built to sustain operations far beyond low Earth orbit for up to 21 days. Unlike the Apollo command module, Orion is designed as an interoperable transport node. Its primary function in the broader architecture is to ferry crews to the planned Lunar Gateway, a future space station that will serve as a permanent staging point for dedicated surface landers. However, the viability of this complex architecture remains an open variable. Building a sustained lunar presence requires consistent political and financial backing over decades. If subsequent missions face cancellation, Artemis II risks becoming a localized achievement rather than the foundation of a permanent presence. It is a misconception to view Artemis II as merely a modernized Apollo 8. We are no longer willing to accept the immense risk profiles of the 1960s. The modern baseline for crew safety demands near-perfect systemic reliability for long-duration deep space operations. During this 10-day flyby, the crew will push the Orion capsule to its operational limits. They will test manual piloting, orbital communication relays, and radiation shielding in an unforgiving environment where an immediate abort and return to Earth is physically impossible. While robotic probes have mapped the lunar surface with precision, automated systems cannot fully replicate the adaptability of human operators in unpredictable environments. Artemis II serves as the mandatory proving ground. It will empirically validate whether our modern engineering can actually protect an international crew against the lethal radiation and thermal extremes of deep space. Having established the strategic imperative and the geopolitical stakes of our return, we must now examine the complex hardware required to execute this mission. Next, we will analyze the immense power and the critical vulnerabilities of the Space Launch System rocket. To overcome the gravitational hold of Earth and send humans back to deep space, you need sheer, unprecedented brute force. That force is the Space Launch System, or SLS, currently the most powerful operational rocket on the planet. The SLS is designed to generate a staggering 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. It achieves this by combining twin-solid rocket boosters with a core stage powered by 4 upgraded RS-25 engines, the exact same workhorses that previously drove the Space Shuttle fleet into orbit. You might wonder why NASA insists on using this specific, highly expensive, expendable vehicle when reusable commercial rockets dominate the headlines. The answer comes down to departure energy and payload mass. The SLS is the only rocket currently capable of sending the fully loaded Orion spacecraft, its crew, and heavy cargo directly to the Moon in a single launch. A distributed launch architecture where multiple smaller commercial rockets launch hardware into Earth orbit to be assembled or refueled before heading to the Moon is theoretically possible.
However, NASA opted for the SLS to reduce the operational complexity of in-orbit assembly, relying instead on a massive integrated launch stack. It is a common misconception that being the most powerful makes the SLS the most technologically advanced. In reality, the SLS architecture heavily leverages heritage technology to minimize development risks. It is an expendable giant, meaning this multi-billion-dollar vehicle flies only once. But this reliance on heritage technology also inherited its greatest vulnerability. The core stage of the SLS is fueled by a volatile combination of super-cold liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Liquid hydrogen is the most efficient chemical rocket fuel we have, but it comes with severe engineering penalties. Hydrogen is the smallest element in the universe. To use it as liquid rocket fuel, it must be cryogenically chilled to minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit, or minus 253 degrees Celsius. At these extreme temperatures, hardware shrinks, seals warp, and the tiny hydrogen molecules aggressively search for any microscopic path to escape. This isn't a new problem. During the 30-year history of the Space Shuttle program, launches were scrubbed on average nearly once every attempt, with hydrogen leaks frequently being the primary culprit. By using the same fuel and engine lineage, the SLS program inherited these exact same temperamental fluid dynamics. The evidence of this ongoing struggle is thoroughly documented. During the uncrewed Artemis I test campaign, engineers battled persistent hydrogen leaks in the exact same ground-to-rocket connection points. It required multiple fuel loading tests, known as wet dress rehearsals, just to stabilize the system enough to launch. For Artemis II, these challenges have resurfaced. In early 2026, during a critical wet dress rehearsal, ground crews again encountered a liquid hydrogen leak similar to those seen in the shuttle era, alongside an unexpected issue with the flow of helium to the rocket's upper stage. Because the SLS locks a full-stock in-flight abort system during certain early launch phases, like some smaller modern capsules, these ground tests are absolute prerequisites for safety. Every seal and valve must be verified under cryogenic stress before 4 human lives are strapped to the top of this controlled explosive. The SLS is a temperamental titan, an expendable, enormously powerful machine whose sole purpose is to endure the violent 8-minute climb into orbit and push its payload toward the Moon. But once the rocket falls away, the survival of the crew depends entirely on the capsule left behind. How does that small, pressurized capsule keep 4 astronauts alive while plunging through the deadly radiation of deep space? That heavy responsibility falls squarely on the Orion spacecraft. Unlike the capsules currently ferrying astronauts to low Earth orbit, Orion is built for the brutal realities of deep space. It is designed not just as a transport vehicle, but as an autonomous, long-duration lifeboat. It is tempting to compare Orion to commercial vehicles like SpaceX's Crew Dragon, but their operational environments are fundamentally different. Dragon operates a few hundred miles above Earth, functioning essentially as a low-orbit taxi. Orion must survive hundreds of thousands of miles away, where immediate rescue is impossible. To sustain a crew of 4 in this isolation, Orion is equipped with a highly advanced environmental control and life support system. According to NASA and Lockheed Martin specifications, this closed-loop architecture can independently support the crew for up to 21 days without resupply. The system continuously scrubs carbon dioxide and manages moisture, recycling breathable air throughout the cabin. Engineers designed the spacecraft to operate at a reduced atmospheric pressure of 34 kilopascals, or about 5 psi, utilizing an oxygen-rich environment to minimize pre-launch decompression risks. However, engineering models only go so far. While the uncrewed Artemis I mission successfully tested baseline structural integrity, the actual long-term reliability of these life support systems has never been validated with human metabolic loads in deep space. Artemis II is the definitive test. Beyond low Earth orbit, the spacecraft must navigate a severe radiological environment. Once Orion pushes past Earth's protective magnetic field, it is bombarded by solar proton events and cosmic rays. The vehicle's hull and internal storage are specially configured to act as radiation shielding. In the event of a sudden solar storm, the crew is trained to construct a temporary shelter in the central bay of the capsule. By repositioning stowage bags and using dense materials, they can absorb high-energy particles, a makeshift but scientifically grounded defense mechanism. Behind the crew module sits the European Service Module, manufactured by Airbus Defence and Space.
This uncrewed section acts as the powerhouse of the spacecraft, providing primary propulsion, thermal control, and the critical reserves of water and oxygen that feed the crew cabin. But before Orion can reach deep space, it must survive the violent ascent atop the Space Launch System. If the rocket suffers a catastrophic failure on the pad or in the atmosphere, the crew relies on the launch abort system mounted directly above them. This solid rocket-powered tower is engineered to pull the capsule away from a failing booster in milliseconds. Successfully demonstrated during the Ascent Abort 2 test in 2019, this system subjects the crew to extreme gravitational forces but guarantees separation from the explosive yield below. Assuming a flawless mission, the final and perhaps most critical function of Orion is returning the crew alive. Re-entering Earth's atmosphere at lunar return velocities, roughly 40 times the speed of sound, generates intense friction. To survive, Orion uses a classic ablative heat shield. This shield is designed to intentionally burn away, carrying extreme thermal energy away from the capsule's structure.
As we will explore later, unexpected erosion on this exact shield during Artemis I has forced mission planners to carefully recalculate the Artemis II entry trajectory. Every valve, thruster, and shield on Orion serves a singular, unforgiving purpose: to sustain biological life in an environment actively hostile to it. It is a highly complex, isolated microplanet, engineered to keep its occupants breathing, thinking, and working. This advanced pressure vessel is the protective shell for a historic group of individuals. But who exactly are the astronauts chosen to test these systems? And what does their selection signal about the strategic future of human spaceflight?
The astronauts chosen to test the Orion spacecraft represent a fundamental departure from the Apollo-era model. Moving beyond a strict test pilot monoculture, they are the physical embodiment of a new international coalition built for sustained deep space operations. In April 2023, NASA officially announced the 4 individuals who will fly aboard the Orion capsule, which the crew has named Integrity. This specific 4-person team will undertake a 10-day flight to validate the human-rated systems of the entire Artemis architecture. Commanding the mission is Reed Wiseman, a veteran naval aviator and former chief of the Astronaut Office. His primary responsibility is the overall execution of the flight profile, ensuring the crew and spacecraft safely navigate the 6,400-mile flyby distance around the Moon. Victor Glover serves as the mission pilot.
As the first person of color assigned to a lunar mission, Glover brings critical experience from piloting SpaceX's Crew Dragon, expertise directly applicable to Orion's planned manual handling and proximity operations tests in Earth orbit. While the commander and pilot manage the trajectory, the mission specialists are tasked with critical systems evaluation. This involves pushing Orion's life support, communication relays, and radiation shielding to their operational limits during the multi-day transit out to lunar orbit. Mission specialist Christina Koch holds the record for the longest continuous spaceflight by a woman. Her extensive engineering background is absolutely essential for diagnosing potential anomalies in Orion's highly complex yet unproven deep space environmental control and life support systems. Koch's presence on Artemis II marks the first time a woman will leave low Earth orbit. This breaks a 50-year historical boundary, explicitly aligning the mission's operational goals with NASA's broader mandate to fly a crew that accurately reflects the global population. The fourth seat introduces a crucial geopolitical mechanism. Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen serves as the second mission specialist, making him the first non-American to ever fly to the moon, a profound shift in how deep space missions are structured. Hansen's inclusion is not merely symbolic diplomacy. It is a direct result of Canada's material contribution to the Artemis program. Specifically, this seat secures Canada's commitment to building the Canadarm3 robotic system, which is intended for the future Lunar Gateway Station. This international seating arrangement reflects a core strategic shift for the 21st century. Unlike the unilateral space race of the 1960s, the modern Artemis framework relies on the Artemis Accords, binding international partners together through shared hardware investments and shared crew assignments. Preparing this specific crew requires rigorous, highly specialized simulation. Because Artemis II lacks a docked lunar module to act as an emergency lifeboat, a critical failsafe utilized during Apollo 13, the crew must master deep space survival procedures exclusively within Integrity's tight confines. A major uncertainty boundary remains how the crew will physically and operationally adapt to the 10-day deep space environment inside a vehicle that has never previously sustained human life. Their real-time feedback will dictate the safety parameters for the subsequent Artemis III landing mission. Ultimately, Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen are tasked with proving that modern deep space flight can be executed safely by a diverse, multinational coalition. They are the vital human variables in an incredibly complex engineering equation defined by millions of pounds of explosive thrust. But before they can test deep space life support in the vacuum of space, this crew must first survive the violent ascent off the launch pad. In the next few minutes, we will detail the physics required to execute the massive Trans-Lunar injection burn. That massive Trans-Lunar injection begins with raw, unyielding physics on Launch Pad 39B. When the Space Launch System ignites, it unleashes 8.8 million pounds of thrust, lifting a fully fueled vehicle that weighs nearly 6 million pounds off the Florida coast. The initial ascent is purely about overcoming Earth's immediate gravitational hold and punching through the densest layers of the atmosphere. The twin solid rocket boosters burn through their solid propellant in just over 2 minutes before cleanly separating from the core stage. But this rocket does not fly in a straight line directly toward the moon. Instead, the core stage inserts the Orion spacecraft, still attached to its upper stage, into an initial elliptical Earth orbit. This intermediate step is a critical safety parameter. Before committing to deep space, the crew uses this high Earth orbit to perform a comprehensive systems check. According to the Artemis mission profile, this parking phase allows mission control to verify that Orion's solar arrays, thermal controls, and life support systems survived the violent launch. Once telemetry confirms all systems are nominal, the mission proceeds to its most critical dynamic phase, the Trans-Lunar injection, or TLI. This is the precision maneuver that will radically alter their trajectory, expanding their orbital path outward to intersect the Moon. To execute TLI, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS, fires its single RL-10 engine. This engine must burn continuously for approximately 20 minutes, consuming thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen to generate the necessary delta V. During this burn, the spacecraft accelerates to approximately 24,500 miles per hour. That translates to nearly 39,400 kilometers per hour. This specific velocity is the exact threshold required to break free of Earth's dominant gravitational pull. This extended engine firing represents a significant mission bottleneck and a single-point failure risk. If the ICPS engine fails to ignite, or if it shuts down prematurely, the mission simply cannot proceed to the Moon, forcing an immediate, complex abort back to Earth. Mission planners could theoretically design a multiple burn profile, gradually raising the spacecraft's altitude over several days to reach the Moon. However, for the SLS architecture, a single high-energy TLI burn is the most fuel-efficient method to achieve the necessary departure energy. As the ICPS engine cuts off, the crew transitions instantly from high G acceleration to the eerie stillness of zero gravity. Orion has successfully escaped the immediate gravity well of Earth and is now coasting on a ballistic trajectory toward lunar space. Shortly after the burn concludes, explosive bolts fire and the Orion spacecraft physically separates from the depleted ICPS upper stage. From this moment forward, the 4 astronauts are entirely dependent on Orion and its European service module for propulsion and survival. The precision required for this maneuver is staggering. The TLI burn is mathematically calculated to hit a moving target nearly 240,000 miles away, anticipating exactly where the Moon will be 3 days in the future. Even a fraction of a degree of error during the 20-minute burn would drastically alter their lunar flyby altitude, requiring the European service module to expend precious onboard fuel to perform course correction burns during the outbound transit. With the Trans-Lunar injection complete, the violent shaking of launch gives way to a quiet, multi-day coast through the harsh radiation environment of deep space. How will the crew navigate, live, and operate in this isolated void as they approach the Moon? Once the immense acceleration of the Trans-Lunar injection burn subsides, the mission profile shifts dramatically. The Orion spacecraft, christened Integrity by its crew, enters the outbound coast phase. The violent physics of launch give way to silent ballistic physics. For the next 4 days, Orion requires no continuous main engine propulsion. Instead, it rides the kinetic energy imparted by the upper stage, gradually slowing down as Earth's gravity pulls at it before the Moon's gravitational sphere of influence takes over. But the crew is far from idle. Immediately following separation from the upper stage rocket, Commander Reed Wiseman and pilot Victor Glover will execute a critical proximity operations demonstration. This is a mandatory manual flight test. They will use the discarded upper stage as a physical target in space. By manually firing Orion's reaction control system thrusters, the crew will evaluate the spacecraft's handling qualities and rotational control, proving they can manually pilot the ship if automated systems fail. As they push further outward, the physical environment fundamentally changes. The spacecraft crosses beyond the Van Allen radiation belts, leaving the protective magnetic shield of Earth. Deep space radiation becomes a primary operational hazard for the rest of the transit. Inside the capsule, dosimeters actively track the influx of solar energetic particles and galactic cosmic rays. The crew must monitor these radiation levels constantly, validating the shielding effectiveness of the capsule's hull and their specialized protective vests. Simultaneously, the outbound coast serves as a rigorous, real-world stress test for Orion's environmental control and life support system. This is the first time these scrubbers, thermal loops, and pressure systems will handle the continuous metabolic load of 4 human adults. Engineers on the ground will closely watch telemetry on carbon dioxide removal rates and ambient humidity control. Unlike the International Space Station, which relies on regular resupply and extensive filtration, Orion systems must sustain a closed loop with zero margin for error. The reality of living inside Orion is defined by strict physical constraints. The crew operates within approximately 316 cubic feet of habitable volume. That is roughly the interior space of 2 standard minivans, shared by 4 people for 10 days. Within this confined volume, the astronauts execute a tightly choreographed schedule. They must cycle through mandatory exercise regimens using a specialized compact flywheel device to counteract the bone and muscle degradation induced by continuous microgravity. Medical data is continuously transmitted back to flight surgeons in Houston. The crew tests the high-bandwidth optical communication system, streaming high-definition video of their deep space environment, while simultaneously running diagnostic checks on the spacecraft's avionics and backup navigation computers. Ground simulations can model orbital mechanics, but they cannot replicate the sustained psychological and physiological realities of 4 days in an isolated deep space capsule. If a critical life support failure occurred now, returning to Earth would take days, not hours. As the transit approaches the 96-hour mark, the visual perspective shifts radically. The Earth appears as a fragile, suspended marble in the blackness, while the cratered surface of the Moon rapidly expands to dominate the forward windows. The system's checkouts are complete, and Orion is aligned for its most critical gravitational maneuver. In a matter of hours, the crew will fire their engines and swing behind the Moon, plunging into total communication blackout. As Orion crosses the threshold into the Moon's gravitational dominance, the spacecraft prepares for the most critical orbital maneuver of the entire 10-day flight. This is the outbound-powered flyby, a precision engine burn designed to harness lunar gravity rather than fight it. Unlike the Apollo missions that fired their main engines to brake and capture into a stable lunar orbit, Artemis II executes a different physical profile. Orion does not orbit the Moon in the traditional sense. Instead, it rides a highly elliptical path known as a free return trajectory. By targeting a specific corridor in space, the spacecraft uses the Moon's mass as a gravitational slingshot. The European service module will ignite its main engine on the lunar near side, adding just enough velocity to bend their trajectory precisely back toward Earth. The physics of a free return trajectory offer a built-in safety net. If Orion's main engine were to fail after this initial burn, the orbital mechanics naturally pull the capsule back to Earth's atmosphere without requiring a secondary major propulsion event. But executing this flyby sends the crew of 4 hurtling directly toward the lunar far side. According to the 2026 mission plan, Orion will reach its closest approach at approximately 6,400 miles, or 10,300 kilometers, above the cratered lunar surface. At this specific altitude, the astronauts will have a vantage point entirely different from the Apollo landing missions. They will observe the far side's rugged, heavily cratered terrain, testing advanced optical navigation systems over a hemisphere permanently hidden from ground-based telescopes. As Orion physically slips behind the moon's bulk, a fundamental limit of physics takes hold. The solid, 2,000-mile-wide mass of the moon blocks all radio frequencies, instantly severing the crew's telemetry, voice, and video links with mission control in Houston. Telemetry gathered during the uncrewed Artemis I flight confirmed the exact parameters of this orbital isolation. For approximately 34 minutes, the 4 astronauts aboard the Orion capsule will be completely and entirely cut off from the rest of humanity. During this half-hour blackout, the crew must rely strictly on Orion's autonomous onboard computers to maintain life support, thermal balance, and attitude control.
Ground controllers in Florida and Texas can do nothing but watch their clocks and wait. It is a period of absolute operational autonomy. While modern spacecraft feature highly advanced fault detection software, the reality of this far-side transit marks a profound milestone. It will be the deepest communication isolation experienced by any human crew since 1972. When those 34 minutes finally expire, Orion's high-gain antennas will clear the lunar horizon and instantly attempt to lock onto NASA's deep space network. The reacquisition of that radio signal will confirm the gravity assist was successful and the trajectory is nominal. The lunar slingshot effect will have dramatically altered Orion's velocity vector, smoothly trading the moon's orbital momentum for a direct path home. The mission instantly transitions from an outbound exploration flight to a high-speed return scenario. As the moon rapidly recedes behind them, the crew will capture high-resolution optical data of the Earth-Moon system, validating the communication bandwidth required for future lunar operations. However, the successful flyby only sets the stage for the mission's ultimate hazard. The spacecraft is now locked on an unavoidable intersection with Earth's atmosphere, accelerating by the second. Exactly how NASA engineers modified Orion's heat shield to prevent a disaster during this high-velocity re-entry is what we will examine next. To survive a lunar return, the Orion spacecraft must slam into Earth's atmosphere at roughly 40 times the speed of sound. At these velocities, atmospheric friction generates temperatures approaching 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The only barrier standing between the crew and this plasma is the base heat shield. This heat shield relies on an ablative material called AVCOAT, essentially a modern formulation of the exact technology that protected the Apollo capsules. An ablative shield works by intentionally burning away. As the outermost resin layer chars and melts, it carries extreme heat away from the spacecraft's internal structure. It is a proven mechanism, but deep space environments always introduce variables that ground testing cannot perfectly simulate. Following the uncrewed Artemis I flight in late 2022, NASA engineers recovered the Orion capsule and conducted a microscopic post-flight analysis of the AVCOAT surface. What they found immediately triggered an investigation. The Artemis I post-flight review revealed unexpected patterns of erosion. Instead of wearing away in a smooth, predictable gradient, sections of the heat shield's charred material liberated in distinct chunks. This localized spalling resulted in more char loss than any computational model had predicted prior to the mission. The underlying crew compartment remained completely undamaged during Artemis I, which proved the shield's overall structural integrity held. However, spacecraft engineering operates strictly on safety margins. The unexpected wear pattern consumed more of that thermal margin than NASA finds acceptable for a human-rated vehicle. This presented the Artemis program with a severe dilemma leading into 2026. Replacing the heat shield with a radically new material or design would require years of development, forcing massive delays and upending the entire lunar architecture schedule. As a result, the physical shield on Artemis II remains identical to Artemis I. Because the physical hardware could not be fundamentally changed without derailing the decade, orbital mechanics had to provide the solution. Engineers calculated that the specific liberation of the char layer was highly dependent on the exact heating rate and aerodynamic pressure profile encountered during the skip re-entry maneuver. By tweaking how Orion skips off the upper atmosphere before its final descent, mission planners can alter the thermodynamic stresses applied to the avcoat. Artemis II mission commander Reed Wiseman confirmed this modified approach, stating that the crew will actually come in a little bit hotter and a little bit faster. This counterintuitive strategy, increasing the speed of the entry to protect the heat shield, is designed to force the thermal energy to distribute differently across the capsule's blunt base. By shifting the thermal flux, NASA aims to prevent the specific environmental conditions that cause the material to spall in 2022. This mitigation strategy carries its own set of distinct trade-offs. Altering the trajectory to manage thermal loads directly impacts the deceleration profile. This means the astronauts inside will experience a modified, potentially sharper G-load sequence than originally planned for a standard skip entry. Furthermore, this revised trajectory remains an untested variable at true lunar return velocities. While computational fluid dynamics models suggest the hotter entry will keep the heat shield intact and the crew safe, the true confirmation will only occur when the capsule actually hits the atmosphere in 2026. Ensuring the thermal protection system functions perfectly is a non-negotiable requirement, because there is zero backup mechanism once re-entry begins. Every calculation regarding this AV coat erosion has been double-checked, forming the baseline confidence required to place 4 humans inside the capsule. Yet, while the heat shield poses a fundamental challenge for the mission's final hours, the most immediate obstacles have appeared long before the rocket ever leaves the ground. As the 2026 launch window approached, a massive technical fault forced the entire rocket stack back indoors. That retreat from Launch Pad 39B in late February 2026 was not triggered by a single catastrophic explosion, but by the relentless physics of cryogenic containment. Pushing a massive rocket to space means battling the smallest molecules in the universe. During the wet dress rehearsal earlier that month, NASA attempted to load over 700,000 gallons of super-chilled liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen into the core stage. This full countdown practice was meticulously designed to flush out latent hardware defects. Almost immediately, ground teams detected a liquid hydrogen leak at the tail service mast umbilical. Hydrogen is the most efficient chemical rocket fuel currently available, but its tiny, energetic molecular structure makes it notoriously difficult to confine under pressure. Stored at a brutal minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit, liquid hydrogen aggressively shrinks metal components. As these cryogenic fuel lines contract, physical seals can warp just enough to allow microscopic fuel particles to escape into the surrounding Florida atmosphere. NASA mission blogs confirmed this exact leak signature mirrored the fueling anomalies that frequently plagued the Space Shuttle program, which utilized the same RS-25 engine architecture. It also directly echoed similar launch delays experienced during the uncrewed Artemis I test campaign. Engineers eventually managed to resolve the hydrogen leak with localized seal replacements during a subsequent rehearsal. However, sensor telemetry soon revealed a completely separate and arguably more insidious anomaly buried deeper inside the upper stage of the launch vehicle. Telemetry indicated an abnormal flow rate of helium gas routing to the rocket's upper stage. Helium is a vital, inert pressurant. It forces propellant into the combustion chambers and pneumatically drives critical engine valves in the absolute vacuum of space. If helium pressure fails during the actual mission, the upper stage engine cannot restart to perform the trans-lunar injection burn.
The Orion spacecraft, along with its 4 crew members, would be hopelessly stranded in the useless low Earth orbit.
Unable to access the isolated pneumatic lines safely on the open launch pad, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman authorized a complete rollback. The massive crawler transporter reversed its 4-mile trek, carrying the fully integrated stack back into the vehicle assembly building. This necessary retreat instantly nullified the remaining February and March launch windows. NASA formally shifted the Artemis II target to no earlier than April 1, 2026, prioritizing crew survival over rigid, politically motivated schedule adherence. The exact root cause of the helium restriction remains partially obscured pending inspection. It is currently unclear whether the blockage originated from a faulty internal flight valve or a structural defect within the external ground support equipment feeding the rocket. If the issue is isolated strictly to ground support, the flight hardware itself remains fundamentally sound. However, a systemic design flaw in the upper stage pneumatics would require extensive dismantling, potentially pushing the flight schedule much deeper into the summer.
These meticulous, frustrating delays highlight the unforgiving nature of deep space human spaceflight. Every single cryogenic seal and pressurant line must function perfectly, because there are absolutely no emergency repair stations located halfway to the moon. But while NASA engineers carefully dissect valves in Florida, the geopolitical clock continues to tick. Artemis II does not operate in a diplomatic vacuum, and the United States is no longer the only superpower aiming to dominate the lunar South Pole. Artemis II does not operate in a diplomatic vacuum, and the United States is no longer the only superpower aiming to dominate the lunar South Pole. China has formally announced its International Lunar Research Station, targeting the exact same heavily cratered regions for a permanent base. The primary catalyst for this renewed competition is water ice, trapped in permanently shadowed craters. Orbital data confirms these deposits are substantial, offering a vital resource that can be processed into breathable oxygen, drinking water, and crucially, liquid hydrogen and oxygen rocket propellant. Extracting fuel directly from the lunar surface drastically reduces the mass that must be launched out of Earth's deep gravity well. Consequently, whoever controls the most accessible ice reserves will dictate the logistical and economic parameters of deep space exploration for decades. To secure its position, the United States is leveraging the Artemis Accords, a multilateral framework establishing norms for peaceful lunar resource extraction. As of early 2026, dozens of nations have signed on, creating a collaborative legal structure that explicitly supports commercial operations. China is rapidly assembling a parallel coalition for its International Lunar Research Station, directly challenging the Western-led framework. Their uncrewed Chang'e missions have already demonstrated advanced surface operations, and their timeline for a crewed landing aggressively trails the Artemis schedule. In this high-stakes environment, Artemis II is not just an engineering test, it is a diplomatic instrument. By flying a human crew around the moon now, NASA asserts immediate operational dominance, proving to international partners that the American-led architecture is viable. This diplomatic strategy is physically manifested in the crew selection. The inclusion of Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen marks the first time a non-American will fly a deep space trajectory, reinforcing the message that the Artemis Coalition offers tangible access to deep space. However, soft power requires hard engineering to survive. If Artemis II encounters further severe delays, or if the Orion spacecraft fails to validate its life support systems, confidence in the United States' ability to lead a sustained lunar surface campaign could fracture. A fractured schedule opens a vulnerability window. Geopolitical alliances are pragmatic. If the Artemis program stretches too far into the late 2020s, allied nations currently contributing hardware might pivot, redirecting their scientific payloads toward China's more rigidly executed robotic surface missions. This competition is fundamentally about establishing precedent. The first coalition to build sustained infrastructure at the South Pole will effectively write the de facto rules of engagement for lunar operations, interpreting international space law through their own physical presence. The recent delays pushing Artemis II into the spring of 2026 have tightened the global timeline. Every month spent troubleshooting ground support equipment or rocket valves on Earth allows competitor programs to close the technological gap in cislunar space. A successful 10-day flyby secures the alliance. It demonstrates that the massive investment in the Space Launch System and the Orion capsule can actually yield a functional deep space transportation network, providing the necessary proof of concept for the entire geopolitical strategy. Yet, grand geopolitical strategies are ultimately bound by the physical limits of hardware sitting on the Florida coast. Before any nation can claim a single drop of lunar water, the immediate priority remains getting 4 human beings safely off the launch pad. As the geopolitical clock ticks, the focus narrows entirely to the massive vehicle assembly building. What precise sequences must the launch teams execute to finally move this volatile, fully fueled rocket through its final countdown? Once the upper stage helium flow issue is resolved inside the high bays of the vehicle assembly building, the sequence to launch Artemis II begins not with a fiery ignition, but with a grueling 12-hour mechanical crawl. The fully stacked Space Launch System carrying the Orion spacecraft is transported exactly 4 miles to Launch Pad 39B. This movement relies on the massive crawler transporter, carrying millions of pounds of unfueled rocket architecture across a specialized gravel crawlerway. Reaching the concrete pad is merely the baseline. Once locked into position, ground crews from NASA's Exploration Ground Systems initiate final integration, securing electrical umbilical lines, environmental controls, and the massive cryogenic propellant feeds that act as the vehicle's lifeblood. For the first time since the February rollback repairs, all integrated systems are powered up simultaneously. Launch controllers at the Kennedy Space Center verify data telemetry across thousands of discrete channels, ensuring the rocket and ground infrastructure communicates seamlessly. During this pad flow, the Artemis II crew, Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen, conduct their final physical pad walkdown. This is a vital operational rehearsal of the ingress procedures, the suit connections, and the emergency zip wire egress routes off the launch tower. The official launch countdown spans roughly 2 days, heavily structured around built-in holds. These planned chronological pauses give the launch director and engineering teams critical time to resolve minor technical anomalies or track passing weather systems before the master clock resumes. The most technically perilous phase begins approximately 9 hours before liftoff with cryogenic propellant loading. Over 700,000 gallons of super-chilled liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen must be actively pumped from ground storage spheres into the rocket's core stage. This fueling process induces immense thermal shock on the rocket's internal plumbing. As the massive tanks fill, the super cold temperatures cause the metal structure to physically shrink, requiring flexible joints and dynamic seals to prevent the very hydrogen leaks that previously delayed the mission. Because these cryogenic propellants constantly boil off into gas at ambient temperatures, the tanks must be continuously topped off right up until the final minutes. This continuous thermal balancing creates the iconic white vapor clouds seen venting from the rocket. At exactly T-minus 10 minutes, the terminal countdown sequence engages. The ground-based launch sequencer hands full control over to the automated flight software inside the SLS rocket, removing human reaction times from the microsecond critical events of the final countdown. In these fleeting final moments, the Orion crew capsule switches entirely to internal battery power. The rocket pressurizes its propellant tanks for flight, and the four RS-25 main engines undergo a specific thermal conditioning sequence to prepare for the violent shock of ignition. To launch, NASA must thread a very narrow needle. Strict orbital mechanics and daylight recovery requirements dictate highly specific launch opportunities, such as the windows assessed for April 2026. A weather violation or a sudden sensor flag means an immediate scrub.
If the board remains green and the countdown reaches 0, the twin solid rocket boosters ignite, instantly committing the vehicle to flight. There is zero abort capability once the solid fuel is lit. The massive rocket simply must clear the tower. Yet, launching the crew safely into Earth orbit is only the beginning of the physical stresses this spacecraft will endure. When this 10-day deep space mission finally concludes, they face a re-entry so violent it requires a meticulously planned recovery operation in the open Pacific Ocean. When this 10-day deep space mission finally concludes, the Orion spacecraft does not simply plummet back to Earth. Hitting the atmosphere at roughly 40 times the speed of sound requires a radically different, highly calculated approach to ensure crew survival. Instead of a direct ballistic plunge, which would subject the astronauts to crushing G-forces and extreme thermal loads, Orion performs a specialized skip entry maneuver. It dives into the upper atmosphere, utilizing aerodynamic lift to bounce back out, much like a flat stone skipping across a pond. This brief, calculated exit back into the vacuum of space allows the capsule to dissipate massive amounts of kinetic energy and shed built-up heat. Only after this critical cooling phase does Orion initiate its final, steeper descent toward the Pacific Ocean. This specific trajectory profile is not completely static. Following the unexpected heat shield erosion observed during the Artemis I test, engineers have intentionally modified the Artemis II entry profile. Commander Reed Wiseman noted they will actually come in slightly hotter and faster to optimize the shield's performance. As Orion punches through the thicker lower atmosphere, immense friction generates a superheated plasma wake, temporarily cutting off all radio communications. Once clear of this communication blackout, a highly precise sequence of parachutes must deploy flawlessly to arrest the vehicle's plummet. Beginning with 2 drogue chutes and culminating in 3 massive main canopies, this complex deployment system rapidly decelerates the 23,000-pound crew module from supersonic velocities down to a gentle 20 miles per hour just before splashdown. The target is a highly specific coordinate grid in the Pacific Ocean, carefully monitored by mission control. Landing precisely within this zone is critical because hitting the water is not the end of the mission, it is merely the start of a complex, time-critical maritime recovery operation. Waiting near the designated splashdown zone is a United States Navy San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock. This massive naval vessel features a floodable well deck out its stern, an engineering feature specifically designed to haul heavy military equipment directly out of the open ocean. As soon as Orion splashes down, Navy divers and NASA recovery teams deploy in rigid-hull inflatable boats. Their immediate first priority is to stabilize the spacecraft with inflatable flotation collars, preventing it from bobbing violently in the unpredictable ocean swells. The local sea state and weather at the landing site introduce a significant element of uncertainty to the timeline. Unusually rough conditions can delay the extraction process, potentially forcing the crew to remain inside the confined oscillating capsule much longer than anticipated. Once stabilized, a motorized winch system slowly hauls the Orion module directly into the ship's flooded well deck. Only then, within the secured belly of the naval vessel, is the primary hatch finally opened to safely extract the 4 astronauts. This immediate recovery is vital not just for the crew's post-flight medical evaluation after 10 days in zero gravity, but also to physically secure the onboard flight data recorders before extended saltwater exposure or system degradation can corrupt the telemetry. The successful retrieval of the capsule marks the definitive closure of the flight. It validates the fundamental architectural choices required to keep humans alive during deep space transit and survive the brutal physics of atmospheric reentry. But surviving a lunar flyby is merely the prerequisite for the broader program. The massive trove of data extracted from Artemis II now faces a singular, unforgiving purpose: enabling the actual hardware and orbital mechanics required to put human boots back on the lunar surface. The massive trove of data extracted from Artemis II now faces a singular purpose: enabling the actual hardware and orbital mechanics required to put human boots back on the lunar surface. Artemis III is deeply dependent on the operational baselines established during this specific flyby. To land astronauts on the Moon in the modern era, NASA relies on a complex relay system. Orion is not the lander. Its job is strictly to act as the deep space taxi, safely carrying the crew from Earth to a specific halo orbit around the Moon. Once Orion arrives, the Artemis III crew must rendezvous and dock with a pre-positioned vehicle, the Human Landing System, or HLS. NASA has contracted SpaceX to modify its massive Starship vehicle to serve as this initial lunar surface transport. Mission architecture diagrams illustrate this critical handoff. The SLS rocket launches Orion with the crew, while SpaceX independently launches Starship. Starship must undergo complex refueling operations in Earth orbit before flying to the Moon to await the astronauts. But before anyone can safely transfer between two spacecraft 250,000 miles from home, the taxi itself must be proven reliable. Artemis II serves as the definitive stress test for Orion's baseline functionality, ensuring it can operate as an independent safe haven. This flyby mission pushes Orion's life support systems near their maximum operational limits. Engineers must confidently confirm that the spacecraft can autonomously sustain 4 active humans for up to 21 days without major mechanical degradation. Artemis II will also thoroughly test manual piloting capabilities, which are absolutely essential for the upcoming Artemis III docking phase. If automated sensors fail, the crew must prove they can maneuver the heavy Orion capsule with pinpoint accuracy using manual thrusters. Even mundane routines inside the capsule during this 10-day flight provide critical engineering data. The crew will evaluate the performance of their modified intravehicular pressure suits, checking mobility and temperature regulation to inform future, more robust spacewalking designs. However, the exact timeline for the Artemis III landing remains highly uncertain and decoupled from Orion's success. Even if Artemis II performs flawlessly in 2026, the subsequent surface mission is gated by the independent development schedule of the Starship landing system. The Starship architecture requires unprecedented orbital refueling, transferring super-chilled cryogenic propellants between ships and low Earth orbit. This remains a monumental, unproven engineering hurdle that SpaceX must overcome before the HLS can head toward the Moon. While different lunar lander concepts, such as Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mk2, are actively being developed for later missions, Starship is the designated vehicle for the first landing attempt. If its timeline experiences further delays, the entire Artemis III schedule will inevitably slip. Therefore, Artemis II is far more than a simple practice run. It is the necessary de-risking of the most foundational layer of the entire lunar campaign, proving the fundamental physics of the launch, the deep space transit, and the thermal loads of planetary return. Every thermal sensor reading from the heat shield and every diagnostic ping from the life support systems will be intensely scrutinized.
These datasets will directly dictate the final safety margins for the astronauts who will eventually step into the Starship's surface elevator. But this complex relay architecture between the Orion capsule and commercial landers is merely the beginning of a much larger infrastructure project. What is the ultimate vision for humanity's sustained presence in deep space? And how exactly does a brand new lunar space station fit into this expanding picture?
That ultimate vision centers on a fundamental shift in NASA's overarching strategy. The agency is explicitly moving away from the brief Apollo-era sprints of planting flags and leaving footprints, aiming instead to establish a permanent, sustained human infrastructure in deep space. Artemis II serves as the functional prerequisite for this transition. By sending a crew on a 10-day flyby, the mission empirically proves that the Orion spacecraft can safely execute the exact transit profiles required to assemble and supply the upcoming Lunar Gateway. The Gateway is frequently misunderstood in public discourse as simply a lunar version of the International Space Station. However, its architectural purpose is entirely different, acting more as a staging node than a continuous long-term orbital laboratory. According to NASA's Moon to Mars architecture documents, the Gateway will be positioned in a near-rectilinear halo orbit. This highly elliptical path balances gravitational forces, requiring minimal fuel to maintain while providing continuous line-of-sight communication with Earth. This station will function as a vital logistical hub. Future Orion spacecraft will dock here, allowing astronauts to transfer into waiting commercial lunar landers for targeted descents to the challenging terrain of the lunar South Pole. Artemis II's deep space shakedown cruise validates the precise navigation software, thermal controls, and main engine burns that crews will rely on to rendezvous with this orbiting outpost, a capability officially slated to begin with the Artemis IV mission. Yet the Gateway, and even the planned surface base camp, are ultimately treated as operational stepping stones toward a much more distant, complex, and unforgiving destination. The entire lunar architecture is a proving ground for the first human missions to Mars. The physiological telemetry and systems data gathered during Artemis II's outbound coast and flyby are directly applicable to Martian exploration. Orion's regenerative life support systems are being rigorously tested against the harsh reality of deep space isolation. Once beyond the protective bubble of Earth's magnetosphere, the crew faces severe exposure to galactic cosmic radiation and potential solar particle events. The physical shielding strategies and onboard radiation monitors validated on this flight are foundational data points. Engineers will use this radiation telemetry to design the much heavier, heavily shielded transit habitats required to keep humans alive during a punishing, multi-month interplanetary journey to Mars, where rapid aborts back to Earth are physically impossible. This stepping stone strategy relies on a core assumption. Testing complex resource extraction technologies and long-duration habitats in lunar orbit allows NASA to identify and resolve catastrophic failures when a crew is only 3 days away from home, rather than millions of miles. Despite the rigorous planning, this extensive incremental architecture carries significant strategic uncertainty. The multi-decade timeline spanning from Artemis II to a Martian landing is highly vulnerable to fluctuating political will, changing administrative priorities, and intense budget constraints. Furthermore, some aerospace analysts argue that deeply embedding our infrastructure into the lunar gravity well could inadvertently delay the Mars objective. Breakthrough technologies, such as nuclear thermal propulsion, could theoretically enable direct Earth-to-Mars transits, bypassing the lunar staging ground altogether. Nevertheless, abandoning the Gateway and lunar surface would fracture the multinational partnerships cemented by the Artemis Accords. This grand multiplanetary vision relies entirely on the tangible, gritty engineering reality of this specific flyby, acting as the ultimate anchor. After decades of development, extensive technical hurdles, shifting budgets, and grand strategic plans, we must step back and look at the total picture.
What is the final, robust synthesis of what the Artemis II mission truly represents for humanity? To answer what Artemis II truly represents, we must look past the launch pad spectacle. This mission is the vital fulcrum between the Apollo era and our modern, multi-planetary ambition. It is fundamentally a triumph of cautious, systems-level engineering over intense political and budgetary pressures. Unlike the space race of the 1960s, this campaign is designed for permanence. Artemis II accepts a highly deliberate test cadence because the goal is no longer just planting a flag. It proves an integrated, human-rated deep space architecture can operate safely and reliably. The core mechanism of this achievement lies in a unique hybrid design. NASA fused legacy hardware, specifically Space Shuttle main engines and solid rocket boosters, with automated flight control systems, creating a working bridge between proven physics and modern avionics. This architecture carries a massive trade-off. The Space Launch System is expendable and expensive, contrasting sharply with the commercial space sector. Critics argue that relying on a multi-billion-dollar, non-reusable rocket is an anachronistic approach to exploring the solar system. Yet the rigid safety culture dictating this pace is unavoidable. The 2026 delays, driven by persistent liquid hydrogen leaks and upper-stage helium flow issues, are not failures. They are the calculated reality of managing cryogenic fuels, or a single error means catastrophe. We see this calculated caution in the mission's return profile. After analyzing unexpected heat shield erosion on Artemis I, planners explicitly modified the Orion capsule's re-entry trajectory, actively tweaking the physics of a Mach 32 atmospheric interface to guarantee crew survival. Beyond hardware, Artemis II validates a new geopolitical framework. With a Canadian astronaut on board and the European Space Agency providing Orion's critical service module, this flyby proves that deep space is now a sustained, international collaborative effort. It also carries profound symbolic weight. By sending the first woman, Christina Koch, and the first person of color, Victor Glover, into lunar orbit, NASA aligns its exploratory goals with a broader, more inclusive human identity. The stakes for this crewed test are existential. NASA cannot adopt the ethos of moving fast and breaking things. A catastrophic loss here would likely trigger a multi-decade political retreat from human deep space exploration entirely. Therefore, clearing these operational thresholds is mandatory. This 10-day flyby mathematically verifies the life support systems, the deep space navigation network, and the radiation shielding required to keep humans alive across the Earth-Moon system. It simultaneously validates the modernized ground infrastructure on Earth. Every cryogenic loading procedure tested at Pod 39B and every recovery protocol executed by the Navy in the Pacific establishes the operational baseline for the coming decade. Artemis II emerges not as a final destination, but as a high-stakes opening chapter. It confirms the vehicle functions, the international coalition holds, and the foundational physics of returning humans to the moon remain firmly within our grasp. From frozen hydrogen lines on the launch pad to the irradiated vacuum behind the lunar far side, this mission tests the absolute limits of mechanical precision. It is the necessary, cautious leap required before attempting anything more complex. But tracing a trajectory around the moon is only the beginning. To truly achieve the dream of a permanent base, we must figure out how to safely descend from that orbit, survive the final drop, and leave new footprints in the lunar dust. To safely descend from that orbit and leave new footprints in the lunar dust, NASA requires the exact flight data this specific flyby will generate. Artemis II is not the destination. It is the fundamental prerequisite for the Artemis III lunar landing. When Commander Wiseman and his crew splash down in the Pacific, their mission ends, but their telemetry initiates a critical handoff. Every structural stress test and life support metric from the Orion spacecraft dictates the safety margins for the next crewed launch. That subsequent mission, Artemis III, will introduce an entirely new architectural layer. While Orion is built for deep space transit, it cannot land. Instead, it must serve as an orbital command center, remaining in lunar orbit while a separate human landing system descends. Currently, NASA is heavily reliant on the successful development of SpaceX's Starship human lander to fulfill this role. The Artemis II flyby clears the transit pathway, but the actual touchdown depends on coordinating this massive, next-generation landing vehicle with Orion in a high lunar orbit. The physical footprint will also require entirely new hardware. Unlike the intravehicular flight suits worn during the Artemis II launch, surface operations demand advanced, highly flexible, pressurized gear. NASA has contracted Axiom Space to develop the specialized extravehicular mobility units for this exact purpose. These new suits are necessary because the targeted landing zone is radically different from the Apollo missions. Instead of flat equatorial plains, Artemis III is aiming for the lunar South Pole, a region defined by extreme thermal gradients, jagged crater rims, and permanent shadows. Navigating this treacherous southern terrain is why the deep space navigation and communication tests of Artemis II are absolutely critical. If Orion's optical navigation networks and deep space network uplinks show any latency during the 2026 flyby, the pinpoint landing of Artemis III becomes geometrically riskier. By validating the human-rated transit system today, Artemis II effectively removes the question of if we can survive deep space, leaving only the timeline of when we will touch down. The mechanical bridge between low Earth orbit and the Moon is finally restored. However, the timeline for that next giant leap remains highly fluid. The complex dependencies of the Artemis architecture mean that any hardware anomaly discovered during this 2026 flyby could push the subsequent surface mission further into the late 2020s or beyond. Yet, even with timeline uncertainties, the historical shift is permanent. We are transitioning from an era where the Moon was a distant memory into a reality where it functions as an active, expanding operational theater for human science and engineering. Furthermore, the presence of Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen on Artemis II cements this return as a deeply international endeavor. Future footprints will not just represent a single nation's geopolitical triumph, but a global coalition operating under the framework of the Artemis Accords. Ultimately, the lunar dust we aim to disturb is just a proving ground. The extraction of polar water ice, the assembly of orbital stations, and the mastery of partial gravity operations are all explicitly designed as the necessary homework for a human mission to Mars. The 10 days of the Artemis II flight will echo for decades. It is the definitive proof that the 50-year gap since Apollo 17 was not an abandonment of deep space, but rather a long, necessary period of technological preparation and strategic realignment. As the SLS rocket prepares for its 2026 launch, the modern lunar era officially begins. The next time you look up at the Moon, remember that the hardware required to live there is finally being tested, and humanity's permanent departure from Earth is underway.